Another day of review for your final exam. In this chapter, we're going to be discussing plants. Just a quick review over all of the important stuff that we can talk about. So I'm just going to be going over these slides rather quickly. So make sure you're following along, paying attention, taking some notes if you have the opportunity to do so as we review for your final exam. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about plants and the plant kingdom, what makes a plant, and all that stuff. So most scientists agree that plants have the following characteristics. So first of all, plants are eukaryotic and most are multicellular, meaning that they have membrane-bound organelles, have a nucleus, right? And they are multicellular, meaning that they have a bunch of different cells working together to make the plant. And these cells cannot live independently from each other. Plants also have tissue, especially designed for transporting materials. Plants have cell walls made of cellulose. That's a really important factor. This is what makes them different from fungi and different from animals, is that their cell walls are made of cellulose. They also have this interesting thing called a cuticle. This is a waxy layer found on the outer, typically on the outer skin of the leaf, and it protects the leaf and sometimes the herbaceous stem from water loss, evaporation, bacteria, diseases, and predators. And plants have a multi-stage life cycle, meaning they go from gametophyte to sporophyte, back to gametophyte, and that process goes back and forth. That's what it's called. That's what that multi-stage life cycle is. And also, all plants are going to be producers, meaning that they're going to make their own energy, typically through the form of photosynthesis. Okay. Now, how do we tell? So that's how we tell plants apart from other things. Now, how do we tell plants apart from each other? So there are a couple of things that we're going to look at. One, do they have seeds? So if they have seeds, they're going to be classified differently, and according to their vascular tissue. So do they have seeds, and do they have vascular tissue? Vascular tissue is used to transport nutrients and water up and down the plant. These vascular tissues are called xylem and phloem. Xylem are responsible for transporting water up the plant, and phloem is responsible for transporting sap or sugary water or nutrients to the place where it's needed. It can be either up or down. It really is in any direction. Okay. So there are three major categories of plants. The first of which is a non-vascular plant. These plants are called bryophytes. They do not have seeds, and they tend to be very, very small. So if they don't have vascular tissue, they tend to be very small, like barely even visible. You can see them, but you can barely tell them apart one from another because they're so tiny. Example of these are things like moss. Then you have seedless vascular plants. The example of this is a fern. So they do have vascular tissue, so they can grow a little bit bigger, but they don't have seeds. So they'll actually still reproduce by the means of spores. And then you have seed-bearing vascular plants, and these are all the plants that we're most common, most of the plants that we see. These are flowering plants, gymnosperms that have cones and things like that. So that's the most common type of plant that we see is going to be a seed-bearing vascular plant. All right, so non-vascular plants, the name for them is bryophyte. Like I said, most of them are extremely short. They do not have true roots, stems, and they are seedless. Okay, this is the structure, and I'm going to put this over to the side over here. This is the structure that we see in a non-vascular plant. It's going to be made up of two phases, gametophyte, sporophyte. Remember, gametophyte stage produces gametes, and sporophyte stage produces spores. The spores is produced, lands on the ground, and grows into the gametophyte stage. The gametophyte stage is going to allow for reproduction or sexual reproduction. Sperm-egg fertilization is going to occur, and it's going to produce the sporophyte stage. In this case, it's going to create this capsule-like structure that holds the spores, which will eventually be released, and that's how you get that cycle. Okay. In this case, the gametophyte stage, that's the green leafy shoot, and it's going to be responsible for being the main part of the plant. So most non-vascular plants spend a majority of their lifespan in the gametophyte stage, and they're going to have these rhizoids, which are root-like structures. They're not actually roots because they're not used for the absorption of nutrients. They're just used for anchoring. So they're going to use those roots to hold on to things like rocks and stuff like that. Then you have the sporophyte stage. That's this stage right here. In our case, it's called the capsule. And really, all it does is store the spores. So there's that. Okay. Then These are some examples of them. Then you have seedless vascular plants. The most common example of a seedless vascular plant is going to be the fern. And they tend to grow a little bit larger because they do have vascular tissue which allows them to transport the water and nutrients. So they can grow a little bit taller. All right. Now, just like bryophytes, these plants do rely on water. Okay, so bryophytes tend to live in places near or around bodies of water, or places where it rains really frequently, so that as the rain falls or water rushes over them, it allows for the sperm to be transported into the egg. The same thing is true in seedless vascular plants. Since they don't flower or do anything, they also rely on water, and that water typically comes in the form of rain. When it rains, it allows for the sperm to swim into the egg and allow for fertilization. These are some examples of seedless vascular plants. You can see the image there of the fern. Okay. All right, then we get to seed plants. Now, there are a couple types of seed plants, but let's go ahead and talk about this. Seed plants are most familiar type of plants, and they have vascular tissue. Seed plants are also the plants that tend to grow the largest, right, in vertical, so they tend to be the tallest plant. And they reproduce by seeds in addition to spores. Excuse me. Their seeds are multicellular. All right. This is one type of seeded or seed vascular plant, and this is the angiosperm. And these are the plants that produce flowers and fruits. Any type of plant that you see that has a flower, it would be classified as the angiosperm, and that angiosperm eventually will produce some kind of fruit. Not necessarily a fruit that we'll eat, but some kind of fruit. Fruit meaning something that surrounds the seed. Right? Then you have gymnosperms. These are the plants that produce cones. These examples are like a pine cone tree or stuff like that they produce cones. All right. Angiosperms are the largest groups of plants in the world. So if you look at a plant, it's probably an angiosperm. You can pretty much guess that it is. Reason for that is because this is going to be the way that they reproduce by the form of those flowers. So angiosperm seeds are fully covered. They're surrounded by a fleshy material called a fruit, and all angiosperms are flowering, and the flower is responsible for attracting insects to allow for fertilization. Then you have a gymnosperm. Gymnosperms, they don't produce flowers, and they rely on a pollen cone and on a seed cone. So instead of relying on an insect, they're actually just going to have strength in numbers, so they're just going to kind of rely on quantity. They're just going to release a huge amount of pollen into the air. The wind is going to come through, pick up the pollen, and that pollen is going to be carried by the wind to a seed cone. And when it lands in there, it's going to fertilize. So if any of you have seasonal allergies, a large aspect of that is caused by gymnosperms because they release so much pollen into the air. Right, so we're going to talk now a little bit more specific about the plant structures. First of all, we're going to talk about the external structures. The first one we're going to discuss is the roots. This is the part of the plant that typically grows underneath the soil, and it's used for extracting soil, specifically extracting water. This can be its main job, extracting water from the soil. Now, some root structures can also absorb nutrients and minerals from the soil. But like I said, their main job is to get the water that they need. There are a couple types of root structures. You have a taproot structure and a fibrous root structure. So taproot is one main root with small projection coming from it. And a fibrous root is a bunch of roots coming from the same position and splitting up from there. Okay, then you have the stem. This is the part that supports the plant and eventually goes from the roots and grows out of the soil and eventually turns into the leaves. So the stems are going to be the support structure of the plant, and it's going to be used for transporting water and nutrients up and down the plant. So the xylem and the phloem are going to flow through the stem or move through the stem, and they're going to allow for that movement of water. Now there are two types of stems that we discussed. You have a woody stem and a herbaceous stem. Woody stem is like a tree trunk, okay, it's just kind of made of wood. And then a herbaceous stem is green. Now the difference here is that woody stems tend to be firmer and more rigid, whereas an herbaceous stem tend to be more flexible. Okay, but their roles are going to be very similar. Okay, monocot and dicot. Monocot is the group of angiosperms that have vascular bundles evenly distributed throughout their stem. So there'll be a circle, right, and they'll be spread out around the edge in regards to a monocot. Sorry, monocot is just kind of like evenly, randomly separated throughout all around the inside of the stem. Then a dicot is that you have that vascular bundle, I like to say vascular ring, around the outer portion of the stem. Okay, external structures, you have the leaves. Leaves are really, really important because these leaves are going to be responsible for photosynthesis. Basically, all the sugar of the plant, all the glucose that the plant needs to survive, all of that is going to be produced on the leaves. So they're really, really important. Right, this is the structure of the leaf. We talked about this quite a bit. You can see this structure in your textbook, so I'll go through it from memory as much as I can. So you have the top layer, that's the cuticle, that's that kind of clear coating that we see up there. That's the waxy layer that protects the leaf and makes sure that it keeps the leaf keeps the leaf from drying out, too much excess of evaporation, also protects it from the environment. Okay, then right underneath of that you have the epidermis. That's this layer right here, and that's responsible for the production of the cuticle. So the epidermis is obviously still a protective layer as well, but it's also going to be the responsible for producing the cuticle. Then you have right underneath the epidermis, you have this tightly packed grouping of cells, and that's called the palisade mesophile. And it's a tightly packed grouping of cells with chloroplasts. So in this layer is where we're going to see photosynthesis occur because it's full of those chloroplasts, and it's going to serve a lot of important jobs. Right? It's going to stop the light from penetrating deeply into the leaf, and a lot of the light's going to get trapped in here, which is really important. Right, and also it has the chloroplast, so it undergoes photosynthesis. So glucose is going to be produced here. Then underneath that, you have the spongy mesophile, and it's called spongy because there's a lot of more empty space in comparison to the one on top. This spongy mesophile is really more known for what is inside of that layer, and it's the vascular bundle that's actually covered by my screen. So that's these right here. So that's how the xylem and the phloem pass through the leaf. The phloem is going to take the sugar that the leaf's producing to the rest of the body, and then the water is going to come up through the xylem and then eventually, help in the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so that's the spongy mesophile. Also, the spongy mesophile can be used for storage. Stores excess amount of starch and nutrients and glucose that's made by the leaf. And also, that empty space is where the gas is going to come into and basically allow for it to be used in photosynthesis. So, gas comes into this spongy mesophile and then it's used in photosynthesis up here. Then after that, you have the lower epidermis. So there is a top and the bottom of the leaf. The top always faces the sun. The bottom faces away from the sun. The major difference is the top has the cuticle and the lower epidermis has the stomata. Now remember, stomata are the actually little holes or pores. These are openings on the underside of the leaf that allow for gas exchange. So carbon dioxide is going to come in and oxygen is going to come out. Okay, so that's there. And then the brown illustration here, and they're not actually brown, but those brown illustrations are what we call guard cells, and they open and close to regulate the flow of oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the plant. All right, bark. So bark is the outer layer, and it's made up specifically in woody stems. It's the outer layer that is made up of dead cork cells, and it protects woody stems from the environment, kind of like armor. You have annual rings. Annual rings are the groupings of the xylem. As the plant widens, so that xylem dies off, and it creates those rings inside. And you use those annual rings to be able to determine how old the tree is. Outermost layer is called the cork. The cork cambium produces the cork. Bark protects it, the rest of the really important, delicate structures inside of the tree. We went over that rather quickly because you don't have to know that in huge detail. It's enough to know that the cork is the outer layer that protects the stem, and then the cork cambium is the thing that produces the cork. Cell walls of millions of plant cells support the weight. Cellulose contains a lot of energy. Okay, so cellulose is the structure or the molecule that makes up the structure of the plant. But remember, anything that ends in lose stands for sugar. So cellulose is actually also a sugar molecule, so it stores a lot of nutrients inside of it. So when an animal eats a plant, right, it gets the glucose from whatever the leaves produced, but also the cellulose is also a good source of energy as well because it's a sugar molecule. Now, plants are supported by turgor pressure. Turgor pressure is what we illustrated in the past when I talked about basically a water balloon. So inside each cell of the plant, there is this this organelle called the central vacuole that gets filled with water, starch, sugar, and other things, but mainly gets filled with water. And that water, it's basically like a balloon that swells up with water and causes rigidity. So the more water there's inside of that organelle, the more pressure there is on the cell, so the cell can stand up really firm. So if the plant loses a lot of water, the water inside of that organelle goes down and it kind of shrivels up and makes the plant wilt. Okay? All right, and that's chapter 8. I hope you guys enjoyed this chapter. I know this was a relatively quick one. We talked about the structure of the plants, the different types of plants. I hope you guys are having a great day. Hope you guys are having a great week. And I'll be making another video for you guys tomorrow. And have a great rest of your day. See ya.